Okay, everybody, Cooke, he's coming to give us another talk on the historicity of Jesus. He's done this before, but hopefully this will be slightly better audio quality for the YouTube file.
Right.
And so then it's with you. Thank you very much for coming in.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's good to be able to applause before you speak. Woohoo! Now, I'm not going to go over a lot of the detail that I did last time, mainly because I've written a new thing that I'd like to share with you. I will be going over some of this aspect of what's called the Christ myth, but I want to talk about it, if I can, in the context of the way it's been discussed in New Zealand as part of the way that Jesus is discussed, and the nature in which discussions about Jesus in New Zealand have changed in the last century and a half. I find that absolutely fascinating. If you think about how a discussion on Jesus would happen in the 1860s, for instance, as opposed to the 1960s, as opposed to the 2000s, you can imagine that there would be a great difference, and of course there is. 5 years before the Treaty of Waitangi, Strauss's really important book, The Life of Jesus, was published, which was groundbreaking, as some of you may know, in the sense of looking at the mythological elements of the whole Jesus story and the differences in each of the four Gospels, and putting emphasis on that. So from the very time that New Zealand's been settled in a European sense, there's been no time when there's been a non-problematic understanding of Jesus. What I did was, in this bit of writing, which I'm hoping to be part of a book on the secular heritage of New Zealand. I want to talk about the secular nature of New Zealand as a taonga, as a treasure, because often we hear comments about something being merely secular, as if it's some horrible excrescence you picked up on your shoe. We should be able to value the secular nature of New Zealand, and that's what I'd like this book to be doing. And this chapter, I'm hoping, is going to be a part of that. So, and the other thing that's interesting about different talks about, different conversations, different public controversies about Jesus in New Zealand is how they have mirrored, and in some cases not mirrored, the international scholarship of the time. Now, as you probably know, in terms of the international scholarship, we've had popularly known as quests for the historical Jesus. You had the first one that lasted, the dates for that are reasonably good, from Strauss's book, 1835, The Life of Jesus, ending, say, 1910, when the English translation of Albert Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, was published. And that first quest was looking for what started to be called the historical Jesus, as opposed to the Christ of faith. So this was the first time that you were able to see that there was a difference between the two. Up until the 19th century, nobody really thought that there was any difference between Jesus as an historical figure and Christ as an object of faith. And that first quest for the historical Jesus was looking toward unpicking that and calling into question just whether those can be seen together in the same sort of way. One book that popularized the first quest was written by a man called William Rathbone Gregg. It was published and it went in through 9 editions. So it's a very, very influential book. His wasn't original scholarship. He was using the scholarship of others. But he was more accessible and wrote for more of a non-specialist audience. So he concluded his book. He said, our conclusion then is that we are and may remain Christian, and that we can and ought to obey the Christian rule of life. But that in order to do either, we must deal with the kernel and not the husk. We must penetrate to the true mind and temper of Jesus through the accretions that have overlaid it, the literalism that has disfigured it, and, be it said with all reverence, the Orientalism and the incompleteness, if not the imperfection, which mingled with and coloured it. Holding this, the utmost possible conquests of intelligence and learning are divested of their terrors, and it is not with Christianity that science can ever be at issue, only with theology calling itself Christian. So what he's doing here is a brilliant summary of so much of what the first quest of the historical Jesus was about. It was to find the guts of the Jesus, the kernel. So this was the first time that we were able to assume that there were layers of interpretation, layers of mythology, layers of dogma that had been like archaeological layers of dirt and sandstone over the original Jesus, a pure and undefiled Jesus that needs only to be excavated clear of all these accretions over the subsequent decades and centuries for us to find the genuine pearl. That's what the first quest of the historical Jesus was about. And that got a lot of people into a lot of trouble. Strauss, his book, The Life of Jesus, he lost his academic post and never got another one again in his long life. And even people who supported Strauss, other academics who supported Strauss, did so at the cost of their job. And they were hounded quite mercilessly, and the quality of their Christian commitment was impugned, which in the 19th century often meant the quality of their own personal integrity was impugned. So if you were a Straussian, it's probably a mild exaggeration to say that it's almost like supporting pornography, but it's not an unreasonable thing to say. If you're being accused, among the theological world at least, of supporting Strauss, then you were morally suspect. And a lot of people lost their jobs as a result. In New Zealand as well, and some of the controversies, one of the first controversies in New Zealand was a man called Garland, who was a Methodist. In the 1890s, he was speaking to a Methodist, he was based in Wanganui, speaking at a Methodist conference in Dunedin about the findings of 19th century biblical scholarship on the Old Testament, as it gets rudely called, the Hebrew Scriptures in actual fact, and the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. So the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the original insight on that, the original orthodoxy was that Moses had written them. And one of the first things that came out of the quest for the historical Jesus in the 19th century was that Moses didn't write them. He couldn't have written them. Many of the facts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, antedate Moses. They were after his life. Moses in Deuteronomy writes about his own death, which, you know, is a pretty tricky thing to manage. And there are various other problems with the Mosaic authorship of Pentateuch. And this really exercised 19th century minds. And so Garland, Reverend Garland, was talking to a Methodist conference in Dunedin in 1892, saying that we don't have to worry too much about this. It is an issue, and we're going to have to learn to live and grow with it. So he was taking a progressive, modern approach to it. And a Methodist layman in Matter, William Shepherd Allen, owned a lot of land around the Waikato, and he was still an MP in England too. I don't know how he managed that. So he was an MP in England, presumably an absentee one, because he was living here in New Zealand, and he was a bit of a dogmatist for Methodist theology, and he wrote a quite excoriating pamphlet criticising Garland and doing 2 things, and you find this right to this very day. You see this with Bishop Brian Tamaki. When he's talking about theology, they do 2 things. They do one thing. A, if this liberal interpretation of Christianity is going to be taken seriously, then Christianity collapses. And with that, Western civilization very often. Blakelock talked about that against Gearing in the 60s. We'll get onto that hopefully a bit later on. So on the one hand, they had this apocalyptic sense of what's at threat if the traditional idea of Christian belief is questioned in any way. But on the other hand, they do this sanguine idea of, oh, these silly old, liberal woofters, they can say what they like. The truth of Christianity will survive them. They will come and go, but the truth of Christianity will be here until eternity. So on the one hand, they do this rather fearful, apocalyptic idea of, oh, woe is me, everything's at threat. And on the other hand, they do this quite sanguine idea of, silly people, let them get on with it and ignore them. So William Sheridan Allen did that quite a lot in his pamphlet. And what he's saying, which religious conservatives say to this day, is they quote, it's a question of which part of the Bible they quote. The conservatives often quote Paul, and I think it's Colossians, I should know this, but I don't, that if the resurrection of Christ is not true, then our faith is as nothing. So they're talking about that too, and that's the passage that they usually cite when they're talking about how much is at stake with the liberal assault on traditional dogmas. They also, as I say, question the quality of the reformers' faith. So they see them as lukewarm, wussy liberal types, limp wrists, who are coming out wanting to change Christian truths in order to pander to the current fashions. Whereas I, as a religious conservative, am upholding the timeless truths of Christianity. Those are the two divides, and you see that come up time and time again. So in the 19th century, New Zealand was wanting to understand Christianity in the sense of, Rachel, it was wanting to understand Christianity in the sense of the first quest of the historical Jesus. Even among free thinkers at the time, what they said would be not out of place in many churches now. This is Robert Stout, who gave a talk about Jesus in 1884. They met deliberately on Christmas Day just to piss the locals off. But what he was saying wasn't really very radical. He said, there is interwoven a great deal that is mythical. So you can hear that he's been reading his Strauss. And if we leave the mythical out of the life of Christ, if we leave out those things that universal experience tells us cannot be true, and are not true, if we take up his moral concepts, what better teaching can we follow? So again, you get this idea of the kernel and the husk. Traditional Christianity has layered the kernel with all these husks of theology and dogma and interpretation, but we need to get back to that kernel, that inner core of insight and truth and indeed beauty. And free thinkers, as well as religious progressives and liberals, are largely agreed on that. So it's never been a question in New Zealand or anywhere else of secularists against religious people. That's just a simple little opposition that isn't really supported by the facts. You've had secularists with liberal religious people often agreeing very much on things. We'll talk a bit later on where they've disagreed. And then the religious conservatives, and their position has been more steady, if you like, over the century and a half. One of the really a nasty little spat among the Presbyterians, they're masters at nasty spats, was a man, John Gibson Smith, in 1908. And he was talking about, he was making quite a fine point of dogmatic distinction when he was talking about Christ did not die for our sins, but he died with our sins in mind. Now, come on. That sounds to us It's like that how many angels dancing on the top of a pin sort of thing. But that cost him his job. And the Presbyterian Church hauled him up before their authorities and charged him with heresy. And he was never quite the same after that. And he was, again, was viciously sullied and attacked. One opponent, R.R.M. Sutherland, made his views plain when he spoke to his congregation. I believe that false men are a greater danger to the life and well-being of the church than false doctrine. So the conservatives often couldn't distinguish between attacking the idea of the person and attacking the person. And it's not uncommon or unreasonable. If you take the conservative point of view seriously, putting yourself in the position of a conservative thinker on Christian dogmatics, how can you really see that somebody who is opposing Christian dogma is morally a good person? It's quite difficult to do that, because if you're standing against and casting an aspersion against God, who is the author of all possible goodness, how can you do that within the framework of goodness? Yeah, it's a perfectly reasonable point for them in some ways. So they were unable and have made a point of not seeing that the people who oppose them have a moral integrity of their own. They're not prepared to acknowledge that. There's a degree of consistency in that, if you like. So the point about some of these early criticisms is you can hear that they're quite theological and dogmatic. Dogmatic in the sense that they're about dogma. So they're fine-tuned arguments about this or that element of Christian thought. So the arguments about Christianity in the 19th century in New Zealand were in-house arguments. That doesn't stop them being quite vicious and controversial, but they were in-house arguments among people who generally all agreed. Even many of the free thinkers were happy to acknowledge that Jesus was a wonderful visionary and a person whose moral example we would all do well to follow. They just didn't buy the theology that went with it. So it was very much of an in-house argument. The next step on this came, you see, but the point is, how many husks can you start shedding from the kernel? This has been the problem of the historical Jesus. How many husks can you start shedding from that kernel before the kernel itself disappears? And this has always been the problem, and this is where the conservatives, you ought to sympathise with their point of view. At what point does this husk of an allegedly mythological or dogmatic interpretation getting peeled away? Where do you stop doing that, and where does the real Jesus simply become a hollow shell? That's the thing that has spooked religious conservatives and continues to spook them to this day. So their fear about this has been really consistent right the way through. What's changed in some ways has been the religiously liberal position, as they have progressively, so in the 19th century, the husks they were peeling off were things like the 19th century, the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. They didn't really touch Jesus that much. He was still left pretty much alone. Jesus started becoming involved in the husks around Jesus himself, rather than the whole historical context of him, didn't start getting looked at specifically until the 20th century, and in particular in the English-speaking world, once we had the English translation of Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, which was a summary of all the 19th century German works of scholarship and brought the first quest of the historical Jesus to an end. by saying all of these books, what do they tell us? They tell us we cannot really write a life of Jesus anymore. There's no such thing as an historical life of Jesus. Jesus is going to work as an object of faith. That's what a lot of the people before him had been saying. And so how that object of faith, here's where the Christ of faith and the historical Jesus are quite different. They've become separate by the beginning of the 21st century. And this is where the myth theory of Jesus became relevant. Please ask me questions, otherwise I'll just blather on for ages. Feel free to ask me questions at any time. The myth theory people, I think they added 2 and 2 and got about 5, but it was a reasonable thing for them to think. So the myth theory people read their Strauss, and they saw all these mythological references in the 4 Gospels. They saw the accretion of dogmas from Mark, the first Gospel, through to Matthew and Luke, written roughly at the same time, to John, where Jesus becomes the Christ in those 4 Gospels. They saw that addition of mythology. They saw those husks being added on. So what... Sorry, yeah.
So was Jesus not the Christ in Mark's Gospel?
Yes, he was, but he was much more Jesus, a person with brothers and sisters and all of that, wasn't he? And he had a birth, an ordinary birth, born of woman, unlike in Matthew and Luke, where he has a virgin birth, which then in John, the virgin birth disappears as well, and it becomes the Word made flesh.
Yeah, but his birth isn't mentioned in Mark.
No, but he's assumed as born of a woman. Yeah. Where was I? So the myth theorists were seeing all this from their Strauss, and the other person who was relevant to myth theory was James George Fraser, the great mythological writer. He's pooh-poohed now and not held in high regard. He's thought really as a man of letters now than a scholar of mythology. But he was incredibly influential 100 years ago. His book, The Golden Bough, talked about the many parallels to the Jesus story in other mythologies. So you had Mithra, for instance, born in a cave on the 25th of December. They all had to be born on the 25th of December in the Northern Hemisphere, because it's the depth of the Northern Hemisphere winter, and only with the birth of the Saviour God in the depth of winter could you have the hope for the spring to come. So being born on the 25th of December was just standard fare for a saviour figure then. Mithra, born on the 25th of December, born of a virgin, of course. He travelled far and wide as a teacher and illuminator of men. He slew the bull, the symbol of the gross earth, which the sunlight fructifies, in other words, winter. His great festivals were the winter solstice and the spring equinox, Christmas and Easter. He had 12 disciples, he was buried in a tomb, and of course he was resurrected and rose again, and that resurrection was celebrated yearly with great rejoicings, and he was called the Saviour and Mediator, sometimes figures as a lamb, and so on. And there were plenty of sacrificial gods like Mithra. So most of the attributes given to Rabbi Yeshua added on to him were the sorts of things available in the spiritual market of first century. There was a famous book in the 19th century by Kersey Graves called The World's 16 Crucified Saviours, that showed the parallels between the 16 crucified saviours that he identified that all had similar sorts of attributes.
So are you recommending those as historical, as like valid scholarship on the gospel?
Not particularly, no.
It sounds like you're either with you. Like, it would be helpful if you could actually distinguish what you're advocating and what you're saying happened historically. I think most people in the room who don't know the scholarship would think that you're actually suggesting that these supposed parallels are actually accurate. Because most scholars wouldn't think that Mithra was born of a virgin, or that Mithra rose from the dead, and anything like the way that Jesus rose from the dead, right?
Does anyone in this
Yes.
room think that Jesus rose from the dead?
I do.
You do. Okay, so maybe that's why it's different for you. When I hear of different people believing different things in different
It's just
societies,
most scholars wouldn't use the same language as in terms of born of a virgin, rose from the dead, because these are very loaded terms in a kind of Christian background society. When we hear those terms, we think, oh, just like Jesus. But when you actually look at the details of what happened with these things, these aren't taken seriously as scholarship, are they?
Yeah, I don't buy that, no. The problem, I think, with what you're doing is you're trying to establish an exception for the case of Jesus as opposed to all the other claimants to these same attributes, and by giving them sorry?
I think there's a burden on you to actually show some similarity rather than vague linguistic parallels. You actually need detailed historical.
Yeah, it's not.
Scholars don't buy that from the first part.
Well, no,
the scholars
that's.
know that he rose from the dead. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
faith-based belief, which is fine for people to have, but people who believed in Mithra also believed it was their faith that Mithra rose from the dead and all the other 16.
But also, the other point I'd like to emphasise, which I've not done, is that most of the scholarship I'm using are Christian scholars. So I don't agree with you when you say that the scholarship wouldn't do this, that, or the other.
They wouldn't buy the Kelsey Graves or the
No.
James Fraser stuff.
They wouldn't buy Kelsey Graves, and there are problems with James George Fraser, but not in relation to the large number of crucified saviours around, and how popular a motif among saviour figures that was. So I will stress that the scholars I'm using are Christian scholars. So people of impeccable Christian pedigree, John Macquarie, Scottish Presbyterian, I think, Yaroslav Pelikan, Yale-based Catholic, Christopher Rowland, his book Christian Origins, which is published by SPCK, which is the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. It's an old missionary organisation. And SPCK, and Rowland's book, talks about, this is quoting Rowland, Paul's conversion should be, oh no, that's not the other one. Basically where Rowland says that Jesus had no intention of establishing a new religion. Jesus was a Jew and needs to be understood in those terms. That, I would argue, is standard Christian scholarship among anybody who's not in a fundamentalist cow college in Indiana somewhere. So a reputable scholar and reputable Christian scholars will argue in this way, and I've been making a point of using reputable Christian scholars for this. But to get back to, yes, so I don't buy the myth theory argument. So what I'm doing is trying to give you an historical précis. And as I've already said, I think the myth scholars added 2 and 2 and got 5. So they were using sound insights from Christian scholars about the level of the array of husks of mythology and dogmatism that have overlaid the historical figure of Jesus. But to then assume that because these husks are all there and they have a very high, they do a lot of distorting the true view of Jesus, that does not mean, therefore, that he's a myth. I think there's no particular reason to go from there to there. And I'm summarising here because I don't think the myth theory really cuts the ice, but it doesn't need to. let's just talk about the myth theory in New Zealand terms. One of the interesting points about the myth theory is that it was a live issue in New Zealand from about the 1910s right through to 1936 and a bit beyond. So for about 20 years, there were debates, a whole series of debates. The Auckland Town Hall, or Everybody Cinema, which is now gone, but on Queen Street, and the Majestic, which was the biggest cinema in Queen Street in the day, could seat 1,400 people, were filled repeatedly with people wanting to hear debates about the historicity of Jesus. So there would be a rationalist and come along and give this argument, Kersey Graves, J.M. Robertson, people like that, and talk about the mythological accretions, the number of saviour figures with these particular characteristics. And then the churchmen, whichever churchman they could find to debate the issue. The last ones were Martin Sullivan, who went on to have a very prominent role in the Church of England, and Walter Averill, who was son of the Archbishop, the Anglican Archbishop in New Zealand at the time. These were senior church figures. They weren't weirdos from the periphery. So this was a question that exercised quite respectable minds and worried people a lot, and people came along. It stopped becoming an issue after so many debates because, like so many debates, you tend to be talking past each other rather than really addressing an issue head on. And there's just so many debates you can do on whether the reference to Jesus and Josephus is true or an interpolation, da-da-da-da-da. So, but it's interesting that the mythological Jesus debates that were really prominent in Auckland in particular from about 1910 to 1936 and drew lots of people and got quite a lot of controversy in the papers. You can follow the letters to the editor as people are outraged and these people are convinced that this side won and these people are convinced this side won and so on for best part of a quarter of a century. But listen to the change from the theological controversies about Jesus in the 19th century, where it's much more in-house, and it's the idea of Jesus' authority is not yet being questioned. But after the publication in English of Schweitzer's book, those questions could become open and valid questions. Now, this was also during a period of scholarship where the Jesus story fell away a bit, because after Schweitzer, theologians spent sort of 20 odd years trying to figure out what the hell we do with this and what the significance of the quest of the historical Jesus as a book was for the discipline of theology. And you had what's called the quiet years. The next quest, the second quest for the historical Jesus, started after the Second World War. And like the first quest, it was dominated by German, mainly Protestant theologians in establishment universities. And after the war, where existentialism was a really important philosophy, that was the philosophy of the moment, it had a bearing on the second quest. So what the second quest theologians said was, yes, first quest, all right, we can't write a historical account of Jesus, but so what? That's not what Jesus is about. And yes, some of this dogma and these accretions are the husks of doctrine added on with history, but so what? That's not what Jesus is about. What Jesus is about, according to Rudolf Bultmann, although it's a long story with him, he actually didn't like these quests for the historical Jesus, but he was the inspiration for the second one nonetheless, one of those ironies. Bultmann and his supporters, Ernst Käsemann and others, said it's not about that. What it's about kerygma, or proclamation. So what you do is you say, right, I don't give a shit about dogma, I don't give a shit about the historical Jesus. I nonetheless proclaim, by faith, my commitment to Jesus as an ideal, an idea. And that's how I will live my life. I'm not necessarily going to proselytize. I'm just proclaiming it. I don't even have to proclaim it in public. I can proclaim it to myself as an existential commitment. That's what the second quest was about. And it seemed to work in with the existentialist mood of the time after the war, when there was less appetite for sort of finger-wagging didacticism from churchmen, or indeed anybody else. They just had a war dealing with finger-wagging. So the second quest had a slightly delayed impact in New Zealand, like the first quest, but the person who really took the second quest on in New Zealand was Lloyd Gearing. Now, probably most of you are too young, but Lloyd Gearing was a Presbyterian scholar. He was the principal of Knox Theological College in Dunedin, and he wrote an article on the resurrection in the Presbyterian Church magazine called Outlook, and this had a similar sort of impact to John Gibson Smith back in 1908, and the Presbyterians had a fit, because what he was saying basically was what the second quest, what you could infer from the second quest. The second quest wasn't really saying it, but you could legitimately infer it. And there was another group called the Secular Christianity Theologians, a Scottish man called Ronald Gregor Smith. And Gearing quoted Ronald Gregor Smith, who said, "The bones of Jesus can safely be assumed to live somewhere in Palestine." Now listen to how mind-bendingly controversial that would be if you are a Presbyterian, or indeed any committed Christian. There's almost a blasphemy. If he'd said that 40 years before, he probably would have been charged with blasphemy, or certainly heresy. So Lloyd Gearing took on the secular theologians like Ronald Gregor Smith and the second quest, and brought it to New Zealand in the Presbyterian Church, which had had a good time in the 50s, but was losing membership again, as were all denominations in the 60s. 60s was about love and rock and roll and woohoo. And it wasn't about Presbyterian doctrine. And so they were trying to figure out how to reassess and to repackage Christianity in the light of this new New Zealand that was emerging. And so Lloyd Gearing was talking courageously, really, about resurrection is, as he said, a symbol of hope. You can hear that second quest idea in it. He said, yes, it's not true. It didn't happen. Don't confuse the necessity for a physical action of somebody. Now, he was crucified. That's a historical fact in history. He dies on the cross. Who killed him is another point. The third quest really dealt with that. We'll get to that, hopefully. But the point is the resurrection. That's the sticking point of rising again to heaven in a preordained way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh, right? With a view, as in John, that the flesh will then become the Word again. So what Gearing and people like him were saying was that we've got to get away from this idea of history and look at the resurrection as a symbol of hope. And if our faith is strong enough to incorporate that, our faith will be a more loving, less finger-wagging faith that will work in the 1960s in a way that the other ones obviously aren't. Now, of course, this got himself into all sorts of trouble, and the Conservatives at the time... Nice to see you again. No.
Well, but I'm not.
Don't worry. How long do you want me to go on for? You're going to want some food before the next meeting, aren't you? I promise I'll shut up soon.
We've come to hear you. You don't have to shut up.
Okay. Tell me when to shut up if you need food. So the Conservatives, Wardlaw, who ran an advertising agency in Remuera, went to Somerville Church in Remuera Road, which is now, oddly enough, a strong point of religious liberalism he would be rolling in his grave. He got the town hall, and the Auckland town hall was full of people objecting to Lloyd Gearing. They weren't just Presbyterians, they were religious conservatives from around Auckland. There was another one in Dunedin, and on the strength of this popular outrage, at the next General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, he asked for Lloyd Gearing to be tried for heresy. And in November 1967, that happened. The very year America was having a summer of love, we were having a doctrinal charge for heresy. That's the difference between America and New Zealand in 1967. And it was a serious thing. Now, the church was in a very difficult position, as you could imagine. Most of the clergymen in the Presbyterian Church agreed with Gearing. Most of them had been educated by him, coming up through Knox Theological College. They'd read a lot of the same books, but they were really frightened they couldn't agree with them publicly, because in the pews of their churches were a whole lot of people who had not been given any of this education. And so they were stuck to this old literalism. Many years before Gearing, let's just go back and can I find that passage from... This is what a predecessor of Gearing, Henry Major, said, and this has been forgotten by the churches. We must not preach, says Major, what we do not readily believe about the historical dogmas of Jesus, simply because we think our people expect it, and that it will soothe and comfort them and somehow do them good, as it seems once to have done in days gone by. So what Major was saying as a religious progressive was, for God's sake, literally, why are we still teaching the people in our pews this antiquated old nonsense that we, as theologians, know is not true anymore and we can't justify? But the churches, for the better part of a century, and because they're getting more conservative, that's still the case now, have chosen not to educate the flock. So when the flock read in the papers, they read something like Gearing, particularly when they got it on television later on, and this was a terrible shock. So they either went two ways. They either retreated back into the pews and thought that man's obviously nuts or wicked or both, or they thought, oh, thank heaven somebody's saying this at last. I'd read one of these books too, and I thought the same, but I just thought that was just me. But now I'm being told by the principal of Knox Theological College, no less, that these worries I've got are valid. So he helps people out of the church or into more liberal denominations, or to stay in the church and try and fight within the boundaries of the church to liberalise their own denomination. That's what happened. Lloyd Gearing was the most important single incident in New Zealand's religious history. Because unlike all the other debates and conflicts we had in New Zealand, that was the one that hit the widest audience. There's a whole generation, people my age and older, whose religious outlook was framed and very often reframed by Lloyd Gearing. He's still alive, he's 93. He supervised my PhD. I'm the last PhD student he did. Right, now, what's interesting after Lloyd Gearing, you then got what Gearing called the Battle of the Books. So there were a series of books that came out that attacked Gearing. The first one was Blakelock. Again, he was a professor of classics here at Auckland. Very prominent man. Had a very big public profile. And he was a very conservative Baptist. And he wrote a book called Layman's Answer, which was very finger-wagging. And again, he couldn't resist the personal attacks he was quite unpleasant about Gearing and most of the people that Gearing was quoting. I wonder if I can find that. So Blakelock dismissed Rudolf Bultmann, who I mentioned as the preeminent thinker of the Second Quest, as a symptom of a superficial age. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who died in the Nazi concentration camps, was an important Second Quest theologian, was condescended to incredibly as somebody who wouldn't have written as he did had he lived longer. Hello, he was killed by the Nazis. It wasn't exactly a choice of his. The secular theologians, like Ronald Gregor Smith, spoke as they did only because they've not deeply experienced the love of God. And Albert Schweitzer was just dismissed as an eccentric humanitarian. So again, what he was doing was what you see the conservatives doing from the beginning of this, is attacking the person as much as they attack the idea. Yes?
Why do you think he made that comment about Bonhoeffer, that he wouldn't have written it as he did if he had lived longer?
Well, he's assuming that Bonhoeffer would have matured as he got older.
I assume that he's thinking that, you know, modern scholarship has shown some of these things to do with what Bultmann was saying, etc., to be false. I mean, Bultmann isn't exactly taking his gospel anymore by modern scholarship, right?
No, but the book came out in 1967 when he was.
Okay. I think Blakelock's point would have been that modern scholarship in archaeology and things would have shown a greater degree of historicity than Bultmann was thinking.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah.
So that's why he's making the point about Bonhoeffer.
Well, that's generous of you. I don't see it that way. It looks like a pretty unpleasant attack on somebody whose life was cut short by Nazis, and assuming that he would have grown up and got more sensible if he'd lived. But, you know, you may well be right. I don't see it that way. So you had Blakelock's book, which was followed by short pamphlets by Nicholson, another one called By Gifford, and then there was a big book by Blakey, Secular Christianity and the God Who Acts, which was a different sort of book to the other three, but just as combative. But the point is, after a while, people got tired of the whole debate. They were really excited by Gearing in 67 and 68 when his book God and the New World came out. You can still buy that in the second-hand bookshops. It's still worth a read. But after these procession of books came out, people lost interest. They lost interest in Gearing's later books for a while too, because God and the New World was a short book. It's only 160-odd pages, and it was a big picture book. And what people in the 60s wanted, I think, was a big picture account of how is it that we're moral, or try and be moral, or value morality, given that we don't go to church, given that we live in a mainly secular age, and I don't go to church anymore, or I used to go to church but I don't anymore. So how do I manage to be good? How do I see what is good? Gearing answered those sorts of questions. It was one of the first books to take a secular condition as not just some horrid abomination, but what was actually out there, the reality that people were living with. And so he answered that question. When he said God and the New World, he didn't mean New World in terms of the explored Southern Hemisphere. He meant New World in terms of the new world of ideas that we're in, this new secular age that we're moving into. That's what he meant. So when Gearing came to do his more details books later on, they didn't get anything like the readership, because people didn't really want the details. They wanted the big picture, and Gearing gave that to him. His next big picture book was the next one that sold well, Tomorrow's God, came out in 1994. It's another, probably even better for you to read than God and the New World. As again, you can get it for not very much in second-hand bookshops. So you had a series of these debates. The first public controversy about Jesus that hit television was in 1984, a series called Jesus the Evidence, which is actually quite, it wasn't a particularly radical series. It certainly didn't say anything as radical as what Goering had been saying 20 years before. But the difference then was that there was a growing and stronger and more aggressive evangelical component in New Zealand, and they were getting more angry about the trends in liberal religion and the trend in society, and they were beginning to feel, as they still feel, isolated and picked on and a misunderstood minority in New Zealand. And so they occasionally come out swinging for things that really frighten them or annoy them. And the last, Jesus the Evidence, was one of them. And then 4 years later, the film The Last Temptation of Christ, the film version of Nikos Kazantzakis' novel by that name, that outraged evangelicals as well. And the one I went to, there were a group of people stood up and started chanting, and they had to be forced out and all the rest of it. And the rest of them were just telling us not to go in there without actually having seen the film. So these were the first controversies. But what's interesting is that unlike the 19th century controversies, and even the earlier ones with Goering, they didn't attract the same sort of anger. And you could no longer fill the town hall with anger about some public controversy about Jesus. By the 1980s, that wasn't possible anymore. Really, really interesting. New Zealand was changing. And these sorts of things. The issue then, of course, that galvanized the conservative minority, which will be relevant to the debate that you're going to hear now after this, was the homosexual law reform bill that came out and was passed in 1986. And this galvanized the religious conservatives in a way that the Jesus things couldn't, which is interesting on its own. Jesus in the 19th century would have been the issue that would have got religious conservatives out on the street and barracking in the town hall. But in 1986, it wasn't Jesus. It was homosexuality. And of course, that's still a really important issue, and a lot of biblical authority rides or falls on the view you take toward the literal reading of the New Testament. But it was interesting that that issue galvanized the evangelicals and not Jesus. Okay, let's cut to the chase. Come on to the 21st century. When I started reading this, did any of you see last year there was the documentary on television by Brian Bruce, Jesus, the Cold Case? That's what actually put me onto this. I watched the documentary, and then I waited a bit more. I was waiting for the outrage. I was waiting for the filled town hall. And of course, it never happened. You got a bit of spluttering on the various blogs about it, but there was nothing. One group of Christians wrote a complaint to the Broadcast Standards Authority that it was insulting to Christians, and that criticism was rejected. And then, to really annoy those evangelicals, months later, Brian Bruce's documentary was awarded the Best Documentary of the Year award. So, yeah, it's just another sign of how the country's changed. Yes.
Didn't people complain to the Broadcasting Standards Authority that it was factually inaccurate?
They did, yes.
That would seem to be kind of more. I think you're giving kind of one-sided view of things to kind of mocking Christians for their moral views, whereas people were complaining about its factual inaccuracy, not just its.
Right, but yes, they did complain.
Do you think the documentary was factually accurate?
Yes. Yeah, mainly. And certainly the factual inaccuracy argument was not upheld by the Broadcast Standing Authority, who presumably would have consulted relevant academics on this. They'd be unlikely to have made that decision themselves. The point about the documentary was that what the brave thing about Brian Bruce's documentary was him taking the next step, and that could only have happened because of the third quest. Let me just digress briefly on the third quest, then we'll get back to Brian Bruce's documentary. The third quest for the historical Jesus started in the, say, 1973, the publication of Gezer Vermesh's book, Jesus the Jew. That was the key insight of the third quest. Jesus is not the first Christian. He wasn't even a Christian at all. We don't even call him by his real name or his title. He was a rabbi. His name was Yeshua. He was a Jew. That's what we need to come to terms with. And so much of Christianity, what they're doing is they just take for granted all the theoretical and theological husks that have been added over the accretions. But the point the third quest is making is that the kernel of Jesus is no longer Jesus. It's Yeshua. It's Rabbi Yeshua. And the point is, we've been missing that kernel for 2,000 years. And not only have we been missing that kernel, we have been shitting on the Jews. We've been persecuting the Jews that entire time. We have been calling them the Christ killers. We've quoted the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, where Jesus apparently says to the Jews, "You are the devil. You have no good at all because there is no good in you." Right? It's one of the most anti-Semitic comments ever made. If you want to find anti-Semitism, go to the New Testament. That's where it started. And that's the point that Brian Bruce's documentary really strongly brought out. Lots of Christian scholars have argued this. If you think this is just me saying this, read James Carroll, a Catholic thinker, Constantine's Sword. It's a long book, 500 odd pages, that details the history of Catholic anti-Semitism. Most of the third quest has been about the degree to which anti-Semitism is central to the Christian message. And that kernel that we thought of in the 19th century was an essentially Protestant version of a lovely Jesus who loved people without regard to who they were, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff, is as much of something we're putting on and imposing on Jesus as all the theological accretions. Because it's ignoring his actual situation, that he was Rabbi Yeshua. He was a Jew. He had no intention of forming a new religion. And so Christianity is based on a fundamental error of attributing a whole lot of dogmatic and theological claims about a man who would have not recognized those claims and would have been horrified about them had he been alerted to them. Can I find Pelican's statement? Pelican, who, as I say, is a Catholic scholar based at Yale University, in his book Jesus Through the Centuries, says, "To the Christian disciples of the first century, the conception of Jesus as a rabbi was self-evident. To the Christian disciples of the second century, it was embarrassing. To the Christian disciples of the third century and beyond, it was obscure." So those layers of theology and dogma had obscured that fundamental Jewish element to Rabbi Yeshua. Yes.
Wasn't it the Christian disciples of the first century who wrote the New Testament?
Yes.
That you're saying is theological accretion?
Sorry?
Is it not the New Testament itself that's theological accretion by other stuff?
No, well, the New Testament is as well. You can see that clearly by reading each gospel in its chronological order. So if you read Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John in order, you see each new level of theology and dogma being overlaid on top of the true Jesus as he is being forgotten. Absolutely.
That doesn't fit when you actually look at what Mark himself writes. I mean,
It fits very, very clearly with what Mark says. And, I mean, one part of the proof of that is that if you go to the 16th chapter of Mark, which everybody now recognises as a later edition, it's not in the Codex Sinaiticus and the earlier versions of Mark, that's the most theological of the statements about Mark, and it matches more. Huh?
In Mark 8, Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." It starts off, the first verse of Mark is the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. The first few verses are about, according to Isaiah, about. I mean, there's huge theological content in Mark. I think you're oversimplifying to say that it.
Everything I'm doing, I'm oversimplifying for the sake of a narrative. Yes, that's true. I mean, what I haven't gone into is, and this is another element of the third quest, the number of passages of the New Testament that are not authentic passages of Jesus. The Jesus Seminar sees only one passage in the Gospel of John as an authentic passage said by Jesus. So many of them, including various passages in Mark, a lot of Christian scholars do not recognise as authentic statements in Mark. So that's part of the problem. And of course, we've known this for a long time. How was the New Testament put together? It was put together by Marcion, one of the first most rabid anti-Semites. Why did he put the New Testament together? Because they needed for this group of Christian Jews an idea of himself that could separate them from the Jews, so that they could say, "We are not Jews." And Marcion quite clearly changed significant parts of all the Gospels to suit his theological needs at the time, which was in about 140 to 150 of the Common Era. So what we have of Mark, of all the Gospels, we have those Gospels that have subsequently been severely pillaged and messed around by Marcion in the interests of his anti-Semitism. Why?
So the Gospels that we have, the text, I don't understand what you're saying. You're saying the text that we have today was the text that was manipulated by Marcion?
Yes, of course.
But we had earlier...
No, we don't.
We have fragments of papyri that...
we have fragments, yes.
Before Marcion.
Yes, yeah.
No serious... That's not mainstream scholarship, the idea.
Yes, yes it is. I'm quoting serious mainstream Christian scholars. Yes, you're right. No.
The Gospels as we see it today.
There are fragments that precede Marcion, and those are the ones we see in there. And there are large gobs that are not. The first extant copies of entire Gospels antedate Marcion by 40 years.
But that doesn't mean that...
No, it doesn't. But it means that what it does mean is that there is no clear, proper, full copy of any Gospel that precedes Marcion. There are fragments, you're right.
We have quotes from some of the earlier...
Yes, we do. I'm not disputing that. Of course we have quotes and fragments and bits and bobs. But Marcion was the one that put them together. That's standard Christian scholarship.
People can look it up, but I suggest you do go in and look up and see whether it's accepted that Marcion actually compiled the Gospels. Is that what you're saying?
He brought them together in the same way that Ezra probably brought together the Hebrew Scriptures, yes.
Marcion had a compilation of various texts, but
maybe.
It doesn't follow that our New Testament as we see it today came through him.
Yeah. Okay, well, I would argue that it does, yes. And there weren't numerous extant copies. There certainly wasn't a New Testament before Marcion. There were bits and bobs of stuff floating around. They were given theoretical coherence first by Marcion.
So he changed the text?
Yes, of course he did.
Of which books in the New Testament?
Oh, well, of all of them in varying degrees, depending on how Semitic he thought they were.
The text that we have today, that's not the text that he wrote.
Yes, it is. See, this is interesting. You see, we're reading, and I'll finish now. We're in a point now where there's a chasm. There's a chasm of lack of understanding and inability to communicate between the Christian conservatives on the one side of the chasm, here's the chasm, and the religious liberals on the other side. But what the third quest has given us is a different outlook to the chasm, because there's a view here as well now which looks at Jesus' Jewishness, of the fact that we're actually talking about Rabbi Yeshua, not Jesus Christ. So we're in a position now, and I hope what you can see is from the 19th century, when people generally accepted the standard dogmatic Christian account of Jesus as the first Christian, about whom Gospels have been written, and who was the Saviour. He was the Saviour by virtue of being crucified and 3 days later being resurrected and going to his just reward in heaven. And by the virtue of that resurrection, and by our belief in the fact of that resurrection and the holiness of it, we become saved through him. So that was the standard Protestant account in New Zealand in the 19th century. We now have accounts in our postmodern sort of age that are fragmented and refracted, and all sorts of different accounts, none of which have true authority. But the Christian accounts, most of which I have been retelling you, thank you very much. No, don't worry, thank you, are really subversive to that traditional Christian message. And Christian thinkers have been woefully lax in educating the punters in the pews about this. And then they wonder why the churches are emptying. They're emptying because for more than a century they've not been given an honest account of what the scholarship is, and we then have inability to come to terms with the new realities. The religious liberals have tried to educate, to help make the punters in the pew aware of these new realities. It's usually cost them their jobs within the church. And they've largely failed, really, to change the church, because most denominations in New Zealand now are quite conservative. The Conservatives have won, because people have either left organised Christianity altogether, or they've joined very liberal, non-doctrinal organisations like the Sea of Faith, but they haven't stayed in the traditional denominations, because they're just so conservative, and the line they're giving is so at odds with what conventional Christian theology talks about. And just to justify that, John Macquarie, as I say, one of the most respected Christian theologians of the 20th century, I don't think that's an exaggeration. At the end of his book, Jesus in the 20th Century, no, Jesus in Modern Thought, gives two endings for Jesus. He says that there's one, the happy ending, and two, the austere ending. The happy ending is the ending that you'll get in most churches. Jesus was crucified, he rose on the third day, it's all really nice. The austere ending is Jesus was crucified. There's no resurrection. It doesn't happen. He was buried, as Ronald Gregor Smith said, in Palestine, somewhere in Palestine. So the austere ending, he argues it's possible to see Christian belief surviving it ending at the crucifixion, because it would leave the two great distinctive Christian affirmations untouched. God is love, and God is revealed in Jesus Christ. So he's trying to retain he's going back to the idea of there being a kernel of Jesus. So John Macquarie has abandoned virtually all the husks, including the resurrection, and with it the incarnation, the ascension, and the Trinity. All you have is the crucifixion, and in that the Christian is supposed to be able to concentrate his or her faith and see that how, I'm not sure, but that this demonstrates the idea of God as love. So, Christian scholarship is in has a severe problem on its hands of giving an account of Jesus that's going to work in the 21st century. As Greg Dawes, I'll finish with this person's quote, Greg Dawes, who's in the theology department at Otago University, says there is no way of reconciling Christian claims to religious authority with the knowledge and the methods of the discipline of history. There is no way of doing it, he says. The historical viewpoint of our age undermines claims to biblical authority, while the Jesus of history is not a figure who can be reappropriated for our own time. That's what theologians are saying. So that's where we are. Imagine him trying to say a fraction of that in the 19th century. So that's how much New Zealand has changed. That's how much the world has changed. That's how much Christian theology has changed in this 150 years. And by looking at Jesus as a marker for these changes, it's just a fascinating insight to how we have changed. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry I've gone
on. I got two questions here from Josh, who left earlier.
Right.
This first one says, can you please outline the contemporary non-Christian sources for Jesus? That's his first question.
The contemporary non-Christian,
Yeah.
well, they're exactly the same as the contemporary Christian ones.
Okay. And the second question was, can you please discuss the Josephus passage referencing Jesus, and if it is likely to be a forgery?
I think with that he's meaning at the time of Jesus' life, like Josephus or something.
Oh,
That's the second question.
Oh, no, the first question was the contemporary non-Christian sources. That's Josephus.
oh, contemporary to Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, you could be right, actually. Well, there were very few. There's the Josephus one, yes. Now, Josephus was writing a book that we now know as the Jewish War, that was published after the Jewish War, obviously, which finished in AD, CE 73. And there is a passage in there, which I can't remember the exact passage, but it's to the effect of, and Jesus was the light of the world, or something like that. I mean, to me, it seems just clear that it's a later addition that's been added in there by Christian scholars, perfectly reasonably from their point of view. But most people, I think, and certainly most Christians acknowledge this is not something where secularists or Christians would disagree. Outside of fundamentalist churches and seminaries, nobody else would see that that's an authentic passage of, right?
That's something I'm sure. I think if you look at mainstream Josephus scholars, they'll say that is an historical core to that reference. I mean, there's an Arabic version that was discovered in the 1970s. You know, if you just look in the ancient history journals, there's various articles about that, and it's not matching. To dismiss it entirely, it's not. It doesn't look like it's a straightforward interpolation from later centuries.
Okay, I would think it is.
There's a man called Jesus who was thought to be the Christ.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, there may well be. And certainly the scholars I read don't buy that. But it said, again, you see, what this is an illustration of what we mean by mainstream scholars and how important that is. To me, the mainstream scholars are seeing the Josephus passage as an interpolation. But I'm quite happy to be proved wrong on that. It's not going to matter hugely either way. But as far as I'm concerned, it's an interpolation. The other one is from Tacitus, who talks about Christos. Again, can you remember, do you know the context of the Tacitus passage? No. That was written a lot earlier. I think it was 63 or something like that. That may do. I think it's unlikely. Given the widespread use of the word Christos as Messiah, which from a Roman point of view can easily mean rabble-rouser, because that was the way it was seen by the Roman authorities, there's no reason to believe that one refers to Jesus, but it might do. But I'd be surprised if it does, because the point about the whole Christian story is how totally untouched the world was by it for decades to come. I mean, when did it become an issue outside of Palestine? Really, there's a date in history, and we don't know what the date is. It's one of the most significant dates in all of history. That was the date when the Jews said to the Christian Jews, the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, as they later became called, look, your talk about Yeshua as the Messiah is just not good. It is not right. Please go away and just don't come back to our synagogues. This was about 82, 83, 84, something like that. It's one of the most significant dates in all of history. Because after that, when you could legitimately talk of Christian as opposed to Jew, 50 years after the death of Jesus. And it's that separation of Christian from Jew in the early 9th century of the Common Era that meant that the Christians were under real obligation to show that they weren't Jews. They needed to suck up to the Romans, say, Romans, we're not them. We're not Jews. Right? So you don't have to persecute us. That was why the New Testament is so vitriolic about the Jews, and why with the later the New Testament passage or gospel is, the more anti-Semitic it becomes. That's why. Anything written after 83 or 84, whenever it was, when the Jews and the Christians officially separated and the Christians no longer worshipped as Jews in the synagogue, the Christians needed to accentuate the differences. And that's why it suited their interests to write gospels that talked about the Jews being responsible for the death of Jesus and not the Romans. It just didn't suit the Christian need at the time to write that. So Pilate is whitewashed. All the accounts we have of Pilate is he's a bastard. He's a tyrant. He's viciously cruel. So the idea of him, oh gosh, I can't see any harm with this guy, you know, it just doesn't work as history. Why is it put in there and why is it so prominent? Because it suited the Christian need at the time to separate them from the Jews and to vilify the Jews and to show that the Romans, the Christians, were not a threat. We agree with you about the Jews. In fact, we would go worse, as John did, when John has Jesus say, you, the Jews, are the father of devil.
Weren't the Jews generally tolerated by the Romans? I think that they were given special
Yeah.
treatment in the city of Rome.
They were, yes. The Roman hostility to the Jews came only after Rome became officially Christian. That's when anti-Semitic attacks on synagogues became not only allowed but mandatory, as we saw with Theodosius.
So how does that story fit in with the idea that Christians were trying to distance themselves from the Jews because the Jews were being persecuted by the Romans?
Well, because the Romans were angry with the Jews at the time because they had revolted, remember? The Jewish war, the revolt. They had required Titus to come in and Vespasian to send Titus in and fight an expensive war in a nasty little corner of the empire that wasn't bringing them in money. They were very pissed off with Jews at this time. This is only 10 years after the Jewish war. So you're quite right. Generally speaking, the Romans were much more tolerant of Jews than Christians were later on. But at this time, they still had a snitch on. Yes.
Thanks for the talk.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for being here.